Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Financial markets are bracing for the impact of Donald Trump's return to the White House. He was elected on a platform of, well, I suppose, extreme policies ranging from mass deportations to huge tariffs on trade. And while coming days will reveal just how quickly these policies are implemented, or if they're going to be implemented, investment markets are still set for a volatile ride. Dr. Shane Oliver is Chief Economist and Head of Investment Strategy at AMP. Shane, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Thank you, Sean. Nice to be here.
Now, we're speaking on Monday afternoon, just 12 hours before Donald Trump is to be inaugurated. Is there a sense of anticipation in markets that he's going to go hard in the first week?
To be honest with you, I think markets are a little bit confused. There's a lot of debate around that. If anything, I think markets have sort of toned back some of their expectations and are hoping that he doesn't go too hard. But by the same token, I think most analysts that I've seen are expecting significant announcements in the first week, not necessarily day one, but certainly week one. I think it is going to be a volatile ride. The share markets rallied dramatically after the US election, or in the run up to the US election, and then afterwards into December on the back of his more favourable policies around tax and deregulation. Then they started to worry that that would blow the budget deficit out and the tariffs would cause inflation. US dollar has gone up dramatically since last September, since the Democrats peaked in the polls and the Republicans staged their big comeback, and bond yields have also gone up. So there is an anticipation that something would happen, and most of those market moves can be put down to markets trying to step out what Donald Trump will do precisely. I guess the big debate is the mix of the positive stuff, the tax cuts and deregulation, versus the negative stuff, the tariffs and deportations and so on. And I think markets are sort of leaning more towards a positive stance, but there's still a lot of uncertainty around that.
As far as we are concerned, Australia, what should we be looking at as it affects us? Is it tariffs and the potential for a trade war that hits us most, or is it some of the other stuff that we should be worried about?
Look, I think it's a bit of everything, but it's the tariffs that are the main concern. To be honest with you, I don't think ultimately we will be paying a 10% or a 20% tariff, or rather Americans will be paying a 10 or 20% tariff on imports from Australia. It is worth noting that only 4% of our goods exports go to the US anyway. We actually have a trade deficit with the US. They have a surplus with us. Various comments from Trump's new team, including Treasury Secretary nominee Scott Bessent, have indicated that one of the focuses is on countries that have a trade surplus with the US, and we're not that. We have a deficit. So I think ultimately, it may require a bit of negotiation, but ultimately I don't think we will face those tariffs. But by the same token, we will be impacted if Trump's tariffs impact on China. Then that means less demand for 35% of our exports that go to China. And also if there is a global trade war, then we are very exposed to that. That will mean less economic activity globally, and that will impact us. I guess the other ways we could be impacted, but it's a bit more secondary, is if he blows out the budget deficit. That means higher bond yields, higher borrowing costs. Our bond yields keep going up, just as they've gone up in the US since last September. They've gone up here as well, and that can affect long-term borrowing costs, including longer-term mortgage rates here in Australia. So that's something to watch out for as well. But I think tariffs are probably the big one for Australia.
Just explain immigration, a popularist idea here and in the US, and the idea that he's going to deport, all these tens of or hundreds of thousands of people. Explain why it's inflationary.
Well, it's economists debate this one ad nauseum. There's an uplift to inflation from immigration because it means more demand in the economy. There's also a downlift from immigration because it means more workers. Now, in the US, the bulk of their immigrants are relatively low-income people coming across the border from Mexico. They tend to be different to the immigrants that come to Australia. We've generally got undocumented or boat people, I guess, immigration under control pretty much in Australia. So we tend to have pretty much far better control of our immigration. There's a big mix of skilled people in there, but there's also a big mix of students in there. And they're perhaps not quite as inflationary as they are in the US. If anything, I'd say that I might put that another way, I'd say that the immigrants coming into the US help keep inflation down more than they do in Australia. The reason for that is because they tend to be low skilled. They end up doing the jobs that Americans don't want to do. So working on farms, working in shops and all those sorts of things. There's a bit of that in Australia, but we've also got a higher skilled component. And also you could argue that when foreign students come here, they don't spend as much potentially as American immigrants do. But so you could go in circles on this, but Americans, I guess the big concern on the part of business in the US is that if you deport people who are already in there, a lot of those people are working on farms, in factories, and that would mean an increase in labour costs, more so than it would mean a reduction in spending, and that in turn could add to US inflation.
Stay with me, Shane. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to Dr. Shane Oliver from AMP. Shane, one bit before we move kind of to the crystal ball part, in fact, when you talk about Donald Trump, you're probably crystal ball gazing all the time. Around deregulation, what do you think will happen? There's a lot of talk about deregulation under Donald Trump, getting rid of bureaucracy. You have Elon Musk wanting to get rid of red tape and reduce the size of government, etc. What do you expect to see, and why do markets like it?
Well, it's just funny when you keep mentioning Donald Trump there. I was watching The Apprentice, that new film about Donald Trump, or setting up Donald Trump, on Friday night with my son, and he says, "Oh, I mean, you almost have a similar haircut to you, Dad."
Oh, that's a bit rough.
Although I haven't had the scalp reduction operation at the top there, but and he was making those jokes about my hair and Donald Trump's hair, 4 years ago. So right. I'm not too keen about those jokes returning. But in any case, when I look at Trump's policies, there's actually some very good things from a purely economic point of view. Yep. They're almost Reaganite in their sense. And economists do get excited about some of that because they could add to productivity. A concern in recent years was that big government was getting the upper hand, more government spending here in the US and in Australia and elsewhere. And things in that sense could have a negative impact on productivity. Whereas Trump, you could argue, is going the other way. He's talking about this Department of Government Efficiency with Elon Musk. You could argue that if that is done in a measured and appropriate way, it could lead to a renaissance in US productivity. It's already doing pretty well, but can boost it even further to the extent that you reduce regulation and reduce the federal bureaucracy. So that could be a good thing. The only thing is that there's a limited amount by which they could do anyway, because the federal bureaucracy in the US hasn't grown that much in recent years anyway, and a lot of spending in the US is mandated, which means if you're going to hit the $2 trillion target that Musk and others have talked about, you've actually got to chop into things like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and all those sorts of programs, which Americans won't like. So there's a limited amount to which they can do. But generally speaking, those sort of policies, lower taxes, less regulation in the US could invigorate or keep US productivity levels at relatively high levels. And that's part of the reason why the US dollar has gone up. The US dollar has gone up for a whole bunch of reasons. Obviously, if you impose tariffs, your currency goes up relative to other countries to partly compensate for that. If you increase the size of your budget deficit, you've got to borrow more, you run higher interest rates, that pushes your currency up. And if you deregulate and do things that enhance the supply side, that means more productivity, which means your country's currency should be higher as well. So all of these things go to explaining why the US dollar has gone up. But generally speaking, markets love all that talk about deregulation and DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency. I mean, maybe some people like myself are getting annoyed with seeing Elon Musk always at the top of my Twitter feed under the For You component. No matter how much I try and go back to the following component, he's always in there every morning with some right-wing comment, and that sometimes seems a bit imbalanced to me. But anyway, most markets generally sort of like all the talk about efficiency.
What about in 6 months' time, 12 months' time, let's say the end of 2025? Do you think we will have gone through a period of getting used to Donald Trump? Will we have a better idea of what's going on? What's it mean for markets? I'm not talking about in 3 months' time, but probably in 9 months' time.
I think 9 to 12 months' time we'll have a much better idea. Last time around, it took longer because he moved more slowly, and it was all about the dysfunctionality of his team. It may well be the same again, but this time around, I think he's learnt a lot. He's gone with people that he thinks are appropriate as opposed to people that were recommended to him. So you perhaps should see less turnover in his team. But more broadly, 2017 was all about the tax cuts. 2018, it was about tariffs. And then by 2019, it all settled down and we got used to Donald Trump. This time around, I think it'll happen earlier. You'll probably get all the talk about tax cuts, deregulation, and so on, along with whatever he's going to do on tariffs pretty quickly as we go through this year. And therefore, by the end of the year, we'll have maybe even 9 months. But by the second half of the year, as we go into the second half of the year, we'll have a better idea about Donald Trump. And I think things will have settled down a little bit and we will have started to get used to him. Whereas last time around, that took all the way to 2019 before we got to that point.
Are you looking forward to it as a chief investment officer?
Well, to be honest with you, no, because it creates a lot of noise.
Yeah.
In that sense, it leads to a lot more work, just trying to work out what Donald Trump said overnight. It doesn't mean anything because he's going to make a lot of announcements that are just noise.
Yep.
And he did that back in the past. He announced there's a 25% tariff on Mexico and then it never happens. So that's going to be the case with a lot of these things. You've got to work out what's real and what's not. That I don't like, and I'm not a great fan of Donald Trump's personality. I don't think he's appropriate to be president, even though I can see some merit in some of his economic policies. That said, I mean, it's just life. We go in cycles. The cycles seem to be getting more extreme these days.
Do you know how many presidents you've been an economist for? Have you ever thought about that?
Well, that's a good question. It started when Reagan was there.
Right.
And it's then.
Maybe too many. We'll leave it at that. Shane, thank you.
It's like the number of CEOs that I've seen at AMP. And a lot of that, well.
Fair enough. Thank you for talking to us this morning on Fear and Greed.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean.
That was Dr. Shane Oliver, Chief Economist and Head of Investment Strategy at AMP. This is the Fear and Greed business interview. Remember, this is general information only and you should always seek professional advice before making investment decisions. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's best business podcast. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.